The torches flickered in the Valley of Kings on that fateful November evening in 1922, casting dancing shadows across limestone cliffs that had guarded their secrets for over 3 millennia. Howard Carter's trembling hand held a candle through the breach in the sealed doorway, and when Lord Carnarvon asked if he could see anything, the archaeologist could barely whisper, "Yes, wonderful things." Beyond that threshold lay not merely treasure, but the perfectly preserved ghost of a civilization, golden artifacts stacked to the ceiling, chariots, thrones, and at the chamber's heart, a sarcophagus containing the mummy of a boy who died at 19, yet whose name would echo through eternity louder than pharaohs who ruled for decades. But who was this child beneath the golden mask? Why was he buried with such unprecedented magnificence when his reign lasted merely a decade? And why did so many who disturbed his rest, Lord Carnarvon, Carter's assistant, the radiologist who first examined the mummy, meet mysterious untimely deaths, giving birth to the legend of the Pharaoh's curse? The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb became the archaeological sensation of the 20th century, yet it revealed more questions than answers about the boy who ascended the throne of the world's mightiest empire during its most turbulent religious revolution. This is not a story of conquest or grand military campaigns. This is a tragedy of a child king caught between warring ideologies, of a puppet who may have tried to cut his own strings, of a dynasty's desperate attempt to restore order from chaos. It is the tale of how death can grant immortality, how burial can ensure remembrance, and how the smallest pharaoh became Egypt's most famous. Could a boy raised in heresy save a collapsing empire? Would his brief life matter if his tomb had been plundered like all the others? As we peel back the layers of linen wrappings, golden coffins, and 3,000 years of sand, we discover that Tutankhamun's true curse was not vengeance from beyond the grave. It was being forgotten by his own people, only to be resurrected by ours. To understand Tutankhamun, we must first grasp the revolutionary maelstrom into which he was born around 1341 BCE, during Egypt's 18th dynasty, the zenith of pharaonic power. The empire stretched from modern-day Syria to Sudan, controlling trade routes, gold mines, and vassal states that paid tribute in exotic goods and slaves. Into this world of unprecedented wealth and influence came Pharaoh Amenhotep I, who would commit the most radical act in ancient Egyptian history. He declared war on the gods themselves. Egypt's religious establishment centered on Amun-Ra, the king of gods worshipped at the massive temple complex of Karnak in Thebes. The priests of Amun had accumulated staggering wealth and political power, effectively creating a parallel government that could challenge pharaonic authority. Amenhotep I's solution was breathtaking in its audacity. He abolished the traditional pantheon of Egyptian deities and proclaimed that only one god existed, the Aten, represented as a solar disk whose rays ended in hands offering the Ankh symbol of life. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, abandoned Thebes entirely, and built a new capital city called Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, in the desert, 2,000 miles north. This wasn't mere religious reform, it was ideological warfare. The Amarna period, as historians call Akhenaten's reign, turned Egyptian society upside down. Temples were closed, their wealth confiscated, and the names of traditional gods chiseled from monuments. A form of spiritual murder in Egyptian belief. The priesthood, suddenly unemployed, seethed with resentment. Art transformed from rigid formal poses to flowing naturalistic styles, showing the royal family in intimate domestic scenes. Revolutionary for a culture that had depicted pharaohs as remote, godlike figures for over 1,000 years. Foreign policy faltered as Akhenaten obsessed over his religious vision, while Egypt's vassal states sent desperate letters, discovered in the Amarna archives, begging for military support against Hittite expansion. The empire was fracturing. Into this chaos, around 3041 BCE, a boy was born who would be named Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, his parentage remains one of Egyptology's great mysteries, debated in academic journals with the intensity of a detective novel. For decades, scholars assumed he was the son of Akhenaten and the legendary Queen Nefertiti, but DNA analysis conducted in 2010 on royal mummies revealed a more complex and disturbing truth. The genetic studies, led by Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, identified Tutankhamun's father as the mummy known as KV55, almost certainly Akhenaten himself, but his mother was not Nefertiti. Instead, she was an unidentified royal woman, dubbed the Younger Lady, Mummy KV35YL, who was genetically Akhenaten's sister. Tutankhamun was the product of incestuous union, a practice the royal family employed to keep bloodlines pure, but which had devastating genetic consequences. This inbreeding manifested in Tutankhamun's physical form. Examination of his mummy revealed numerous health problems: a severe clubfoot, a cleft palate, choler disease, which caused bone necrosis in his foot, and a curved spine. He walked with a cane. Over 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, many showing wear patterns, indicating regular use. Analysis of his skull suggests he suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy. His immune system, compromised by inbreeding, left him vulnerable to disease. The golden boy buried in splendor was in life a disabled youth struggling with chronic pain and limited mobility, a humanity that the gleaming death mask conceals. We know almost nothing of Tutankhamun's childhood. He likely spent his early years in Akhetaten, a purpose-built city of white stone and painted palaces overlooking the Nile. Did he play in the royal gardens while his father destroyed temples? Did he understand that the old gods were being erased? Or did the world of Amun-Ra and Osiris seem like fairy tales to a boy raised in monotheism? The art from this period shows Akhetaten's family in surprisingly tender moments. Children sitting on laps, couples holding hands, but also reveals the pharaoh's 6 daughters by Nefertiti. Tutankhamun was not the crown prince. He was a spare, perhaps even an embarrassment, evidence of his father's need to produce a male heir through desperate means. Then, around 33-6 BCE, everything collapsed. Akhenaten disappeared from historical records. He likely died, though some scholars suggest he was deposed. Nefertiti, who may have briefly ruled as a female pharaoh under the name Nefertiti, also vanished from history. The succession became murky, but a short-lived pharaoh named Smenkhkare appeared briefly before also dying mysteriously. The Amarna experiment was failing catastrophically. Foreign territories were being lost, the economy was in turmoil, and the traditional religious establishment waited like vultures for their chance at revenge. Into this power vacuum stepped Tutankhamun around age 8 or 9, ascending the throne approximately in 32 BCE. Imagine the scene: a disabled child, barely able to walk without assistance, crowned as the living god Horus, the son of Ra, lord of the 2 lands. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt would have dwarfed his small head. The crook and flail, symbols of royal authority, must have seemed enormous in his hands. He was not a king, he was a symbol, a vessel through which others would rule. And rule they did. 2 powerful figures emerged as the true powers behind the child pharaoh's throne. The first was Ai, who held the title God's Father, likely an elderly advisor who may have been Nefertiti's father, making him Tutankhamun's great-grandfather or step-grandfather. The second was Horemheb, the commander of Egypt's armies, a military strongman with soldiers' loyalty and ambition burning in his eyes. These men had survived Akhenaten's revolution and recognized that their fortunes depended on steering the boy king away from his father's heretical path. The coronation was not a celebration of continuity, it was a counter-revolution disguised as tradition. The young pharaoh's first recorded act was symbolic yet profound. He changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, from living image of the Aten to living image of Amun. With this transformation, He became the repentant son, rejecting his father's god and embracing the deity Akhenaten had tried to destroy. Can we imagine what this meant to a child? Did and Horemheb explain that everything his father believed was wrong, that the Aten was false, that the past must be restored? Or was he too young to understand the theological implications, mechanically repeating words written by others while his crippled foot throbbed with pain? The first years of Tutankhamun's reign focused on a single monumental task: undoing his father's revolution and restoring Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of cosmic order, justice and balance. The Restoration Stela, a massive stone monument erected at Karnak Temple, provides our most detailed account of this period, and its language reveals the desperation of the moment. The temples of the gods and goddesses from Elephantine to the marshes of the Delta had fallen into neglect. The inscription proclaims, "Their shrines had become desolate, overgrown with weeds. Their sanctuaries were as if they had never been. Their halls were a footpath. The land was in confusion, and the gods had turned their backs on this land." This wasn't mere religious propaganda. It reflected genuine social collapse. The temple economy, which employed thousands and distributed food to communities, had been dismantled. Festivals that marked agricultural seasons and brought communities together had ceased. The spiritual infrastructure of Egyptian civilization had crumbled. Tutankhamun's regime announced a comprehensive restoration program. Temples would be rebuilt and re-endowed with land and servants. The priesthood would be reinstated with their privileges. Statues of the gods, smashed during Akhenaten's iconoclasm, would be recarved and reconsecrated. Most dramatically, the royal court would abandon Akhenaten, the heretic city, and return to Thebes and Memphis, Egypt's traditional power centers. The counter-revolution was complete, but who actually made these decisions? Certainly not a 10-year-old boy. The evidence points to a triumvirate. The wily administrator, Horemheb, the military commander, and Maya, the overseer of the treasury. These men faced an empire in crisis. Egypt's gold reserves, once seemingly infinite, had been depleted by Akhenaten's building projects and religious endowments to the Aten cult. The army, neglected during the Amarna period, needed reorganization. Vassal states in Canaan and Syria, sensing Egyptian weakness, withheld tribute and contemplated rebellion. The young pharaoh became the face of this restoration, appearing at ceremonies to restore the monuments of the gods. We can imagine him, small and limping, leaning on a cane while priests chanted and incense smoke swirled, dedicating new statues of Amun-Ra. Did he feel the weight of history? Did he understand that he was erasing his own father's legacy? Or were these merely elaborate performances in which he played a role, his mind wandering to simpler concerns, hunting, games, the girl who would become his wife? Tutankhamun was married to Ankhesenamun, his half-sister. They shared Akhenaten as a father, but had different mothers, in a union that was both dynastic necessity and genuine companionship. She was slightly older, perhaps by 2 or 3 years, and had been born Ankhesenamun, third daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Like her husband, she changed her name from honoring the Aten to honoring Amun, becoming Ankhesenamun. She lives for Amun. The marriage was consummated, and twice Ankhesenamun became pregnant. But the genetic damage from generations of inbreeding exacted its price. Both children, both daughters, were stillborn. 2 tiny mummified fetuses found in Tutankhamun's tomb, carefully preserved in miniature coffins, represent one of history's most poignant artifacts. DNA analysis confirmed they were his children, one around 5 to 6 months gestation, the other 8 to 9 months, nearly full term. The second child likely killed Ankhesenamun's hopes for a third attempt. Her body may have been too damaged to risk another pregnancy. These tragedies are recorded not in text, but in objects. The tomb contained a lock of hair from Queen Tayo, Tutankhamun's grandmother, sealed in a tiny coffin bearing her name, perhaps a talismanic object meant to help the young couple conceive. The The burial included items for children, toys, miniature furniture, tiny boxes. These were not merely symbolic offerings for the afterlife. They were the remnants of desperate hope, of a dynasty trying to perpetuate itself against biological reality. Yet evidence suggests their marriage contained genuine affection. The famous painted chest from the tomb shows Tutankhamun presenting her husband with flowers while he sits relaxed, informal, a private moment captured in art. The back of the throne, perhaps the most beautiful object from the tomb, depicts Tutankhamun gently anointing Tutankhamun with perfumed oil. The attend's rays, still visible, not yet removed, blessing them both. Her hand rests tenderly on his shoulder. Whatever the political calculations that created their union, it appears to have developed into companionship, perhaps even love. Two young people, genetically doomed, finding comfort in each other while powerful men made decisions in their names. Despite his physical limitations, Tutankhamun embraced the pharaonic role as Egypt's supreme military commander. At least symbolically, his tomb contained elaborate military equipment, composite bows, dozens of arrows, leather scale armor, daggers, including one with an iron blade made from meteoritic metal, more valuable than gold in the Bronze Age. 6 chariots were disassembled and packed into the tomb, their wheels and bodies decorated with battle scenes showing the king trampling foreign enemies. Did Tutankhamun ever actually lead troops into battle? The evidence is ambiguous, revealing the gap between propaganda and reality. Temple inscriptions from Karnak, commissioned during his reign, show the traditional imagery of Pharaoh smiting enemies. Nubians, Asiatics, and Libyans falling beneath his mace, but these were conventional depictions repeated for every pharaoh, regardless of their actual military involvement. Given his disability, it's unlikely he personally led cavalry charges or fought in hand-to-hand combat. However, Egypt did conduct military operations during his reign, primarily aimed at reasserting control over restless territories. The general Horemheb, who would eventually usurp the throne, led campaigns into Nubia and the Levant. A painted box from the tomb shows vivid battle scenes, Egyptian chariots crushing Nubians and Asiatics, bodies sprawled in death, prisoners being rounded up. The king is depicted in his chariot, drawing his bow, but these images represent royal ideology, the pharaoh as the embodiment of Egyptian military might, rather than documentary evidence. What's fascinating is that Tutankhamun may have actually participated in at least some military activities. Analysis of leather scale armor found in his tomb shows wear patterns consistent with actual use. Not ceremonial display, his bows weren't just props. They were functional weapons calibrated to his strength. Some scholars suggest he may have accompanied campaigns, perhaps riding in a chariot, which would have supported his weak leg to boost morale and fulfill the symbolic role of warrior king, even if he remained safely behind front lines during actual combat. The foreign policy priorities were clear: restore Egypt's prestige and control after the neglect of the Amarna period. Nubian gold mines needed securing. They were the backbone of Egypt's wealth. Levantine city-states needed reminding that Egyptian power remained real. But unlike his ancestors, Thutmose III or Amenhotep II, who personally led armies on years-long campaigns conquering from the Euphrates to the Fourth Cataract of the Nile, Tutankhamun's military legacy would be restoration and maintenance, not expansion and glory. He was a pharaoh of recovery, not conquest. As Tutankhamun matured into his mid to late teens, Egypt experienced a cultural flowering, a conscious effort to reconnect with pre-Amarna artistic traditions while incorporating some of the naturalistic innovations from Akhenaten's reign. This hybrid style produced some of ancient Egypt's most exquisite artworks, many of which ended up in the young king's tomb. The royal workshops, re-established in Thebes and Memphis, hummed with activity. Goldsmiths, stonecutters, painters, and sculptors received generous patronage to create monuments affirming the restoration of traditional religion. Tutankhamun commissioned additions to the Luxor temple and Karnak, including massive statues of himself and restoration of Amun-Ra's sanctuaries. At Memphis, he ordered the expansion of temples to Ptah, the creator god of craftsmen. The artistry reached transcendent levels. The golden throne found in his tomb represents perhaps the finest furniture ever created in antiquity. Wooden frame overlaid with gold and silver, inlaid with semi-precious stones and colored glass, depicting intimate scenes of the royal couple. The canopic shrine, which protected the king's mummified organs, featured 4 goddesses carved from gold-covered wood, their arms outstretched protectively, their faces expressing such serene compassion that viewers today still pause in awe. The golden death mask itself, 11 kilograms of solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian and obsidian, achieved such perfection of proportion and expression that it became ancient Egypt's face to the modern world. But beneath this golden surface, tensions simmered. The restoration enriched the traditional priesthood, but it also empowered them to challenge royal authority once again, the very problem that had driven Akhenaten's revolution. Now elderly, maintained control through his administrative experience and religious connections, but Horemheb's military power presented an alternative power base. The treasury, managed by Maya, strained under the costs of temple restoration and building projects, while trying to maintain military readiness. Tutankhamun himself, approaching 20, may have begun asserting his own will. Some inscriptions show him referred to as making decisions himself, unusual language suggesting he was emerging from the shadow of his regents. Did he dream of campaigns like his great-great-grandfather Thutmose III, who had crushed the Mitanni and established Egyptian hegemony over the ancient Near East? Did he resent the men who had controlled his childhood, whose names appeared alongside his on monuments? We will never know, because his life was about to end with shocking suddenness, spawning mysteries that endure to this day. If Tutankhamun's life was defined by forces beyond his control, Ankhesenamun's was doubly so. Born as Ankhesenpatan, she was the 3rd daughter of the most controversial royal couple in Egyptian history, Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Her childhood was spent in the radical monotheistic court at Amarna, a bubble of religious idealism disconnected from Egypt's traditional society. Art from the period shows her as a young child sitting with her sisters while her parents worshipped the Atum, a family that seemed genuinely affectionate despite the political chaos they created. But then darkness descended when her father died and Akhenaten's religious experiment collapsed. Ankhesenpatan may have briefly been married to Smenkhkare, possibly her own brother or her father's co-regent, in a desperate attempt to maintain dynastic continuity. This marriage, if it occurred, lasted perhaps a year before Smenkhkare vanished from history. She was around 13, already a widow in a dynasty fragmenting into chaos. Her marriage to Tutankhamun was arranged by the power brokers Ay and Horemheb, who needed to legitimize the boy king's rule through union with an undisputed daughter of the royal line. Nefertiti's bloodline carried immense prestige. Despite Akhenaten's heresy, his queen remained respected. This wasn't romance, it was political calculation. 2 traumatized teenagers were bound together to save a dynasty, yet the objects from the tomb suggest something deeper developed. The famous golden shrine shows scene after scene of intimacy. Ankhesenamun offering flowers, adjusting her husband's collar, holding his arm as he hunts ducks in the marshes with a throw stick. These weren't required images of state. Someone, perhaps Ankhesenamun herself, commissioned artwork depicting private moments of companionship. The iconography shows her as his supporter, his helper, his companion, not merely his queen but his partner. The 2 stillborn daughters must have devastated them both. In a culture where royal legitimacy depended on producing male heirs, their failure carried crushing implications. Was Ankhesenamun blamed? Did she blame herself? The tiny mummies in their miniature coffins, lovingly wrapped and preserved, speak to profound grief. These weren't disposed of as tragic failures. They were honored, mourned, and included in the king's tomb so the family could be reunited in the afterlife. Ancient Egyptian women in elite families weren't merely passive possessions. Queens could wield significant power, managing estates, conducting religious ceremonies, and occasionally ruling in their own right. Ankhesenamun likely participated in religious festivals, made offerings at temples, and managed household affairs. But her true influence remained shadowed, known primarily through her presence beside her husband in art and inscription. She was perhaps 4 years older than Tutankhamun, a significant gap in adolescence. Did she guide him, advise him, protect him from courtly intrigue? Or was she equally manipulated by the powerful men surrounding the throne? A remains one of ancient Egypt's most enigmatic figures, a man who maneuvered through the Amarna Revolution, the Restoration, and eventually seized the throne himself, yet who left relatively few monuments or inscriptions. His title, God's Father, suggests he was father-in-law to a king, leading most scholars to identify him as Nefertiti's father, making him Ankhesenamun's grandfather and possibly a great-uncle or step-grandfather to Tutankhamun. He was certainly elderly by the time Tutankhamun ascended, probably in his 60s, ancient by Egyptian standards, where life expectancy was around 45. Yet he possessed political skills sharpened across decades of palace intrigue. He had served Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and possibly the brief intermediate rulers before becoming the power behind Tutankhamun's throne. His survival through such radical changes suggests remarkable adaptability or ruthless pragmatism. Contemporary texts show R making decisions with the counsel of the king, suggesting he maintained the fiction of royal authority while actually wielding power. He held numerous titles: Master of the King's Horses, Overseer of the Cattle of Amun, Fan-bearer on the right side of the king. These weren't merely honorific, they represented control over military resources, horses for chariots, religious wealth, Amun's estates, and access to the pharaoh's person. His relationship with the boy king remains opaque. Was he a mentoring grandfather figure, guiding an orphaned youth through the complexities of kingship? Or was he a cynical manipulator, using a disabled child as a puppet while accumulating power for himself? The evidence allows both interpretations. A appears prominently in Tutankhamun's tomb. Extraordinarily, he performed the opening of the mouth ceremony on the dead king's mummy, a ritual normally reserved for the deceased son and heir. This unprecedented act suggests either deep personal connection or brazen political calculation, A symbolically adopting the role of royal son to legitimize his own eventual seizure of the crown. If A represented administrative and religious power, Horemheb embodied military might. He rose through the ranks during the Amarna period, possibly serving as a military commander even under Akhenaten, and by Tutankhamun's reign held the title Generalissimo and deputy of the king in the entire land. This wasn't just supreme military command, it was vice-regal authority. Horemheb's tomb at Saqqara, he was buried there before becoming pharaoh, and constructing a royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings provides fascinating insights. Its reliefs show him receiving rewards from Tutankhamun, gold necklaces, honor, and depict foreign tributaries bringing goods to Egypt. But the composition is revealing. Horemheb dominates the scenes while the king appears smaller, secondary. The inscriptions credit Horemheb with restoring order and subduing the rebellious. He was ambitious. That much is clear. But unlike many military strongmen who seize power through coups, Horemheb waited. Throughout Tutankhamun's reign, he maintained the fiction of subordination, accepting rewards and titles while building his power base among the army. Why didn't he simply depose the child king and take the crown? Perhaps because A's control of the religious establishment and treasury balanced his military power, creating a stalemate. Or perhaps because Tutankhamun, as a legitimate heir to the 18th dynasty, provided necessary legitimacy to the restoration that a military usurper could not. The relationship between the general and his king likely mixed genuine service with calculated patience. Horemheb did lead real campaigns to restore Egyptian prestige. He did manage military reform, but he was also positioning himself, building loyalty among troops, cultivating relationships with administrators. When Tutankhamun died suddenly, Horemheb didn't immediately strike for the throne, but neither did he disappear. He waited through Aya's brief 4-year reign, then ascended unopposed, suggesting he had spent those years consolidating power until his claim became irresistible. Beyond Ankhesenamun, other women shaped Tutankhamun's world, though their voices are barely preserved. His mother, the mysterious younger lady, died before his reign. Her mummy shows signs of violence, a smashed face that might indicate deliberate mutilation after death. Was she murdered during the political chaos following Akhenaten's death? Did she die in childbirth? Her story is lost, known only through DNA in her bones. His grandmother, Queen Tia, wife of Amenhotep III, was one of history's most powerful women, actively participating in diplomatic correspondence and religious affairs. She survived into the Amarna period, possibly serving as a stabilizing presence. Her hair, preserved in Tutankhamun's tomb, suggests he knew her and valued her memory, or that someone wanted him to carry her essence into the afterlife. Did she tell him stories of Egypt's glory days, before his father's revolution disrupted everything? Nefertiti, his probable stepmother, remains one of antiquity's most famous faces, thanks to the painted limestone bust found at Amarna. But she vanished from history around the time of Tutankhamun's accession, possibly dying, possibly retiring, possibly murdered. If she had lived, would she have wielded power through her daughter Ankhesenamun? Would she have contested Ayan Horemheb's control? And there were others, wet nurses whose names appear on minor tomb objects, servants, perhaps childhood friends. The tomb contained Senate game boards. Did he play against companions, laughing when the throw sticks favored him? His life wasn't just state ceremonies and political intrigue. He was a teenager who grew up in palaces, who experienced boredom and excitement, friendship and loneliness. But these human details are lost, leaving only golden artifacts and the enigma of the boy who wore them. The restoration of traditional religion wasn't merely returning to the old ways. It was a complex negotiation between competing factions, each trying to shape Egypt's spiritual and political future. Tutankhamun's regime faced immediate challenges in reversing Akhenaten's reforms without triggering further chaos. The Amun priesthood, reinstated after being disbanded, didn't simply resume their former positions. They returned emboldened, viewing the Aten heresy as vindication of their warnings about challenging divine order. The high priest of Amun in Thebes had historically been one of Egypt's most powerful positions, commanding vast temple estates, armies of workers, and religious authority that could rival the pharaoh. The restoration gave them leverage to demand not just return of confiscated property, but additional endowments as compensation for their suffering under Akhenaten. The restoration stellar's language is telling. His Majesty spent his time searching out excellent situations for the gods, fashioning their images from genuine electrum with real costly stones. This wasn't mere piety, it was massive wealth transfer. Gold, electrum, a gold-silver alloy, lapis lazuli, and turquoise flowed into temple treasuries. Hundreds of servants were reassigned to temple service. Agricultural land was rededicated to temple estates, but not everyone benefited equally. The Aten cult, while officially disbanded, had created its own constituency. Priests, craftsmen, and officials whose livelihoods depended on Akhenaten's reforms. What happened to them? Some likely adapted, shifting their allegiance back to traditional gods. Others may have quietly maintained Akhenaten's beliefs in private. The shift wasn't as complete as official propaganda suggested. Amulets and small religious objects from this period show continued syncretism, blending Aten imagery with traditional deities. Foreign religious practices also pressed against Egyptian orthodoxy. Egypt controlled territories where people worshipped different gods. The Canaanite Baal, the Hittite storm gods, Nubian deities. Diplomatic marriages brought foreign princesses to the Egyptian court, along with their religious practices. How did Tutankhamun's regime handle this diversity? The evidence suggests pragmatic tolerance. Foreign gods were acknowledged in their own lands, while Egyptian gods reigned supreme in Egypt proper. This wasn't the rigid monotheism of later religions, but a fluid polytheism that could accommodate variation while maintaining hierarchical order. The young pharaoh himself became the ultimate symbol of religious restoration. He participated in the Opet festival at Thebes, where the statue of Amun-Ra was carried from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple in a grand procession. He made offerings at countless temples, participated in the said festival rituals, ceremonial renewal of kingship, and commissioned new religious texts. But was he personally devout, or was he simply performing his role? Given his youth and the control exercised by regents, it's likely his religious life was carefully choreographed, each gesture calculated to demonstrate the triumph of traditional orthodoxy over his father's heresy. Akhenaten's religious revolution had devastated Egypt's economy. The closing of temples disrupted the economic ecosystem that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. Temples weren't merely religious institutions, they were economic powerhouses that employed scribes, craftsmen, farmers, brewers, and countless other workers. They redistributed grain during famines, functioned as banks for local communities, and managed vast agricultural estates. When Akhenaten shut them down and redirected resources to attend worship at Amarna, he created widespread unemployment and economic dislocation. Tutankhamun's treasury official Maya faced the monumental task of economic reconstruction. Inscriptions from his tomb show him restoring the property of the gods and reorganizing the land. This meant surveying temple lands, reassigning workers, and re-establishing the administrative systems that tracked production and collected taxes. It required detailed record-keeping, the bureaucracy Egypt had perfected over centuries, but which had been disrupted during the Amarna period. Egypt's wealth ultimately derived from three sources: agriculture sustained by the Nile's annual flood, trade routes connecting Africa and Asia, and gold from Nubian mines. All three required attention. Agricultural production had suffered from administrative neglect, irrigation systems needed maintenance, and peasants needed seed grain and tools. The international trade system, managed through royal control of imports and exports, had weakened as Egypt's foreign policy faltered. Nubian gold production, supervised by military garrisons, needed securing against raids and rebellion. The tomb artifacts reveal Egypt's international trade networks even during this troubled period. The gold itself came from Nubian mines. Lapis lazuli and jewelry was imported from Afghanistan across thousands of miles through intermediary traders. Ebony and ivory came from sub-Saharan Africa. Cedar wood came from Lebanon. Obsidian might have originated in Ethiopia or Yemen. These luxury goods demonstrated that despite political troubles, Egypt's trading relationships continued, though possibly weakened from their earlier dominance. However, significant economic challenges remained. The Hittite Empire, based in Anatolia, modern Turkey, was expanding aggressively, conquering or intimidating Egypt's vassal states in Syria. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from the period, show vassal rulers desperately requesting Egyptian military support and gold to resist Hittite pressure. Tutankhamun's regime appears to have responded with limited campaigns, but avoided major confrontation, suggesting either military weakness or calculated restraint. The loss of Syrian territories meant loss of tribute and reduced prestige. Maya's administration also faced corruption challenges. The tomb inscriptions boast of his integrity. I filled the magazines with ample supplies, the granaries with barley and emmer wheat. I was excellent in my position, satisfactory in my counsel. This language suggests that corruption and mismanagement had been problems he needed to actively address. Likely legacies of the administrative chaos during the Amarna period, when traditional accountability mechanisms broke down. The ancient Near East during Tutankhamun's reign was a complex web of competing powers, each seeking advantage through diplomacy, marriage alliances, trade agreements, and when necessary, warfare. Egypt, despite its troubles, remained one of the great powers, along with the Hittite Empire, Mitanni, Assyria, and Babylonia. These states communicated through diplomatic letters written in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets, the lingua franca of Bronze Age diplomacy. The most revealing diplomatic crisis involved Egypt's relationship with the Hittites. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma I was among the era's most successful conquerors, expanding his empire southward into Syrian territories that had been Egyptian vassals. Rather than direct confrontation, he employed a strategy of supporting local rulers who would acknowledge Hittite suzerainty rather than Egyptian. This created a buffer zone of contested territories where both empires claimed authority, but neither wanted to risk full-scale war. Egyptian correspondence from this period shows the pharaoh's court maintaining diplomatic fiction. Letters addressed other kings as brothers, implying equality, and focused on exchanges of gifts, actually tributary payments disguised as friendly exchanges. "Send me much gold, for I am building a palace and need gold for its decoration," one letter from a Babylonian king requests. The response would be measured: enough gold to maintain the relationship, but not so much as to seem weak or overly generous. Tutankhamun's regime inherited this diplomatic system, but from a weakened position. The Amarna letters show vassal rulers complaining that previous Egyptian pharaohs hadn't responded to their pleas for help. "The king, my lord, should know that the Hapiru have risen up against the lands which the king gave to me," writes one Canaanite ruler, referring to groups possibly related to the later Hebrews raiding Egyptian territories. The requests go unanswered or receive insufficient support, suggesting Egypt either lacked the military capacity or political will to enforce its claims. Yet Tutankhamun's court couldn't afford to appear entirely weak. Prestige mattered enormously in this diplomatic system. A pharaoh who couldn't protect his vassals or respond to challenges would invite further encroachment. This may explain the military campaigns depicted in Tomb art. Even if Tutankhamun personally couldn't lead armies, campaigns needed to occur to demonstrate Egyptian power remained credible. Horemheb's Nubian and Levantine expeditions served dual purposes, securing actual territory and sending messages to neighboring powers that Egypt could still project force. The absence of royal correspondence in Tutankhamun's name, while Amarna letters exist from his father's reign and from subsequent pharaohs, is striking and may be significant. Did I or Horemheb conduct foreign policy in the king's name without his actual involvement? Was he considered too young or inexperienced to engage in royal correspondence? Or have his letters simply been lost? The accidents of archaeological preservation creating gaps in our knowledge. Perhaps the greatest challenge Tutankhamun's regime faced was internal. The legacy of Akhenaten's revolution had fractured Egyptian society in ways not easily healed. For 17 years, Akhenaten had promoted a radically different ideology, art style, and power structure. While many Egyptians never accepted it, particularly outside the controlled environment of Amarna, others had embraced it, or at least adapted to it. Suddenly reversing course created winners and losers, and the losers didn't vanish quietly. Ketatan, the purpose-built city that was Akhenaten's vision of a new Egypt, faced abandonment. At its peak, the city may have housed 20,000, 50,000 people, officials, priests, craftsmen, workers, and their families. They had built lives there, constructed homes, established workshops, and created a community. Tutankhamun's decision to return the capital to Thebes and Memphis meant these people had to choose abandon their property and follow the court to traditional cities, or stay in a city deprived of its royal patron and inevitably decline. Archaeological evidence from Amarna shows the city didn't empty immediately. Some people remained, squatting in abandoned elite villas, trying to maintain their lives. But without the royal court to provide employment and trade, the economy collapsed. Eventually, the city was systematically dismantled. Stone blocks from Akhenaten's temples were hauled away to be reused in other construction projects, particularly temples to traditional gods. The systematic erasure of Akhenaten's building program was thorough. Modern archaeologists have identified Amarna blocks reused in foundations of later temples across Egypt. This mass displacement created a refugee crisis. Where did these people go? How were they reintegrated into traditional cities? The sources are silent, but we can imagine the resentment families who had invested everything in the new order suddenly finding themselves displaced. Their skills perhaps not valued in the restored traditional system. Former Aten priests couldn't easily transition to serving Amun-Ra. Their heresy would have been remembered. There's also the question of ideological resistance. Did some Egyptians continue to believe Akhenaten was right? That monotheistic Aten worship was true and the return to traditional polytheism was a betrayal? No evidence of organized Atenist resistance exists. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The Restoration regime had every reason to suppress such movements and erase them from historical record. The thoroughness with which Akhenaten's name was later erased from king lists and his monuments defaced suggests authorities feared his ideas might resurface if not completely suppressed. Tutankhamun himself was caught in this ideological conflict. He was born Tutankhaten, raised in Akhenaten's court, presumably educated in Atenist theology. Yet his reign was defined by repudiating everything his father stood for. Did he experience cognitive dissonance, torn between childhood teachings and political necessity? Or did his youth and probable manipulation by advisors mean he simply accepted what he was told, lacking the philosophical depth to wrestle with these contradictions? The answers lie buried with his mummy, forever silent beneath golden mask. As Tutankhamun entered what would be his last year of life, he was approximately 18 or 19 years old, still young by any standard, but approaching the age when an Egyptian king might reasonably begin asserting personal authority. Had he begun to chafe against the control of Ay and Horemheb? Some inscriptional evidence suggests subtle shifts in this final year. Several monuments from late in his reign contain unusual phrasing emphasizing that the king acted himself, or with his own council, bureaucratic language that might indicate he was starting to make independent decisions rather than rubber stamping his regent's choices. An inscription from a temple in Nubia credits him with personally decreeing religious offerings. Another text shows him issuing orders regarding temple administration. These could be mere formulaic language, but they might also hint at a young man emerging from adolescence and trying to claim his throne. If so, this would have alarmed the power brokers who had controlled him throughout his childhood. An independent-minded pharaoh could dismiss advisors, promote rivals, redistribute land and offices, and fundamentally alter the political landscape they had so carefully constructed. Both Ay and Horemheb had spent a decade building their power bases through the puppet king. An autonomous Tutankhamun threatened everything, but he was also growing physically weaker. The multiple health problems encoded in his genes were progressing. Analysis of his mummy shows his immune system was compromised. His club foot caused chronic pain and limited mobility. He couldn't run, couldn't walk long distances without assistance, couldn't participate in the physical activities expected of young men in his society. The walking sticks in his tomb show heavy wear. He depended on them daily. He continued participating in royal activities. Art shows him hunting from a chariot, shooting water birds in the marshes, pursuits possible even with limited mobility. He attended religious ceremonies, appeared at festivals, fulfilled the symbolic duties of kingship. But behind the public facade, was he deteriorating? Were infections or other complications making life increasingly difficult? Tutankhamun died suddenly, probably in January 1323 BCE. We know the timing because his tomb goods include flowers and plants that bloom in late winter, early spring, likely gathered for the funeral. The The season of death matters because it suggests he didn't die from a long, wasting illness. There was apparently enough urgency that his burial preparations were rushed, his tomb unfinished. What killed him? This question has obsessed Egyptologists since the tomb's discovery, generating theories ranging from murder to genetic disease to accidental injury. Each examination of his mummy using increasingly sophisticated technology has added details while leaving the fundamental question maddeningly unresolved. The first autopsy, conducted in 1925 by anatomist Douglas Derry, noted excellent preservation of the body, minus significant damage to the torso from Howard Carter's extraction methods, but didn't establish cause of death. He did note that the king's sternum and most of his ribs were missing, at the time attributed to either Carter's handling or ancient tomb robbers. But this became central to later murder theories. X-rays taken in 1968 revealed a controversial finding: a dense spot at the base of Tutankhamun's skull, inside the cranium. Some interpreted this as evidence of a blow to the head, perhaps murder by blunt trauma. The theory was dramatic. Either I or Horemheb had the young king assassinated to seize power. It fit a compelling narrative: palace intrigue, a puppet ruler who had outlived his usefulness, or begun threatening his handlers, political murder disguised as accident or illness. But more sophisticated analysis complicated this neat story. A CT scan in 2005 showed the skull density was likely bone fragments that entered the cranial cavity during mummification, when embalmers extracted the brain through the nose. The supposed murder wound was probably an artifact of the mummification process or post-mortem damage. However, the CT scan revealed other significant findings: a severe fracture of his left thigh bone femur that occurred shortly before death. The fracture showed no evidence of healing, suggesting it happened days or at most weeks before death. His clubfoot and bone necrosis disease, signs of severe malaria infection, evidence of genetic disorders from inbreeding. This led to a new consensus theory: Tutankhamun died from complications following a leg injury, probably a chariot accident. His weakened immune system, stressed by genetic problems and malaria, couldn't fight off infection that entered through the broken bone. In the pre-antibiotic age, such compound fractures frequently caused fatal septicemia. The injury might have seemed survivable initially, but within days or weeks, fever, inflammation, and septic shock killed him. But even this natural death has suspicious elements. Why was he in a situation where such an injury could occur? If he was so physically disabled, how did he break his femur? Was it truly accidental, or could someone have deliberately caused an injury designed to look accidental? Palace intrigue in ancient Egypt was ruthless. Pharaohs had been murdered before, and murders disguised as accidents were a perennial favorite of political plotters throughout history. What happened immediately after Tutankhamun's death plunges us into one of ancient history's most tantalizing mysteries, known to historians as the Daka Munzu affair. The story comes from Hittite sources, clay tablets from their royal archives that survived in the ruins of their capital city. According to these texts, the Hittite king Suppiluliuma received an extraordinary letter from the Queen of Egypt, identified by the Hittite rendering of her Egyptian title, not her name. The letter said, "My husband has died, and I have no sons. People say that you have many sons. If you send me one of your sons, he could become my husband. I will never take a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am very afraid." This letter was shocking. Egyptian queens did not marry foreigners. They married Egyptian royalty to maintain bloodline purity. For a queen to offer the Egyptian throne to a Hittite prince was unprecedented, suggesting desperation. Most scholars identify the letter's author as Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's widow, though a minority argue it might have been Nefertiti at an earlier date. Suppiluliuma was suspicious. He sent an ambassador to Egypt to verify the letter's authenticity. The ambassador returned confirming that Egypt's king had indeed died, and the queen was genuine in her offer. Satisfied, Suppiluliuma sent one of his sons, Prince Senansa, to Egypt to marry the widowed queen and become pharaoh. Senansa never arrived. The Hittite texts record that he was murdered during his journey to Egypt or shortly after, crossing the border. The exact circumstances are unclear, but Suppiluliuma blamed the Egyptians and considered it an act of war. This incident contributed to deteriorating Hittite-Egyptian relations, eventually leading to conflict. What happened? The most plausible scenario suggests that Ankhesenamun, realizing she was about to be forced into marriage with the elderly Ai, which would legitimize his claim to the throne, made a desperate gambit to invite a foreign prince who would be dependent on her for his position in Egypt, giving her actual power rather than being a pawn. But when Ai's faction discovered the plot, they intercepted and killed Senansa, eliminating the threat to their plans. The political implications are staggering. If a Hittite prince had become pharaoh of Egypt, the ancient Near East's entire power structure would have shifted. The Hittite-Egyptian rivalry that would culminate in the famous Battle of Kadesh decades later might never have occurred. The Bronze Age's geopolitical landscape could have been fundamentally different, but it failed. Ankhesenamun disappears from history shortly after. Evidence suggests she was forced to marry Ai. Depictions show them together as king and queen, though she vanishes from the record soon after, either dying or being eliminated once Ai secured his position. The 70-day period between death and burial, prescribed by Egyptian religious tradition, required elaborate preparation, embalming the body, constructing a tomb if not already complete, crafting burial equipment, preparing the elaborate rituals. For a pharaoh, this was supposed to be a state affair of unprecedented magnificence, demonstrating the kingdom's wealth and the deceased's importance. Tutankhamun's burial was hasty and improvised. The evidence is everywhere in his tomb. The tomb itself, Cave A62 in the Valley of the Kings, was small, 4 chambers totaling about 1,110 square meters, far smaller than tombs prepared for pharaohs who ruled much longer. It was probably originally intended for a non-royal but high-ranking individual, possibly Ai himself, requisitioned when Tutankhamun died unexpectedly. The tomb decorations were incomplete. Only the burial chamber walls were painted, and even those show signs of rushed work, paint splashes, simplified designs, inconsistent artistic quality. The burial goods were an odd assemblage. While spectacularly rich, many items appear to be repurposed from earlier contexts. Some objects bear names of other royals that were modified to Tutankhamun's name. The famous golden mask may have originally been made for someone else. Some scholars argue its facial features look feminine and might have been intended for Nefertiti or Smenkhkare. Objects were crammed into the small space with little organization. Howard Carter found chariots disassembled and stacked haphazardly, boxes shoved into corners, items broken to make them fit. This wasn't the burial of a long-reigning pharaoh who died expected and whose succession was smooth. This was a crisis burial, getting a body into the ground quickly while political battles raged over the succession. The tomb's location is also suggestive. It was dug into the valley floor at a low level, in a spot that flash floods would periodically fill with water and debris. Indeed, geological evidence shows the tomb flooded at least once in antiquity, damaging some artifacts. A pharaoh's tomb was supposed to be placed high on cliff faces, safer and more prestigious. Tutankhamun got a hole in the ground, yet paradoxically, this rushed improvised burial preserved more treasure than any other Egyptian royal tomb. The grand tombs built for great pharaohs like Seti I or Ramesses II were plundered in antiquity, stripped of their treasures by thieves who dug through solid rock to reach burial chambers. Tutankhamun's modest tomb, quickly hidden by debris from subsequent excavations, remained substantially intact for 3,300 years. The boy king who received a second-rate burial became the most richly preserved mummy in history, and became pharaoh, ruling for approximately 4 years, 1323–1319 BCE. He was extremely elderly by this point, probably in his late 60s or early 70s, ancient by Egyptian standards. His reign was brief and left few monuments, suggesting either ill health or uncertainty about his legitimacy that made him cautious about major initiatives. The marriage to Ankhesenamun, if it occurred, was his claim to legitimacy. Marrying the royal heiress theoretically conveyed her right to rule to him, but her rapid disappearance suggests she was either unwilling or was eliminated, i.e., had children from earlier marriages, but apparently no surviving sons to inherit his throne. When he died around 1319 BCE, the throne passed to Horemheb, the military commander who had patiently waited his turn. Horemheb's reign, approximately 1319–1292 BCE, was transformative. He had no royal blood, but claimed legitimacy through selection by the gods. Specifically, Horus of Hernes chose him in a divine oracle. This was a new form of legitimation, not birth but divine selection. It was also conveniently unprovable and non-hereditary, allowing a military strongman to seize power. What followed was systematic erasure. Horemheb initiated what historians call the Amarna Damnation, a comprehensive effort to erase Akhenaten, Smenkhkarto, Tutankhamun, and even Ay from official history. Their names were chiseled off monuments, their cartouches removed, and their reigns omitted from king lists. Later documents show Horemheb's reign as immediately following Amenhotep III, as if the entire Amarna period and its aftermath never occurred. Why? Partly it was practical politics. Horemheb couldn't claim legitimate succession from kings he was erasing from history, so he needed to present himself as a break from a corrupted period, a restorer of Mi'et after chaos. But it was also ideological. The Amarna period and its immediate aftermath represented failure, heresy, and weakness. Better to forget it entirely and present a narrative of unbroken traditional kingship. This erasure nearly succeeded. Before the discovery of Amarna and Tutankhamun's tomb, these pharaohs were barely known. The damnation was so thorough that it preserved them through neglect. Their tombs weren't worth plundering because their names were forgotten, their reigns considered unworthy of memory. Ironically, Horemheb's attempt to erase Tutankhamun from history created the conditions for his preservation and eventual resurrection as Egypt's most famous pharaoh. For 3,045 years, Tutankhamun rested in forgotten darkness. His name was struck from king lists, his monuments usurped, his brief reign relegated to historical oblivion. The ancient Egyptians themselves didn't remember him. Their histories skipped from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the intervening decades never occurred. Classical authors like Herodotus and Manetho, who recorded Egyptian history, never mentioned him. He was the most successfully forgotten pharaoh. Then, on November 26, 1922, Howard Carter peered through a hole in a sealed doorway and saw wonderful things. The discovery of Tomb KV62 became the archaeological sensation of the century, capturing global imagination with the same intensity that landing on the moon would achieve decades later. Here was a virtually intact pharaonic burial, the only one ever found, that hadn't been comprehensively looted in antiquity. The treasure was beyond imagining. 5,398 objects catalogued over 10 years of excavation, from colossal gilded shrines to tiny amulets, from chariots to cosmetic boxes. But beyond the treasure was the story. A boy king, disabled and genetically compromised, who ruled briefly during a period of crisis and died mysteriously young. A tomb that appeared cursed when Lord Carnarvon died, months after its opening from an infected mosquito bite, followed by several other deaths tangentially connected to the excavation. The Curse of the Pharaohs narrative, though scientifically baseless, captured popular imagination and transformed Tutankhamun from historical footnote to cultural icon. The golden death mask became the face of ancient Egypt itself, reproduced endlessly in textbooks, museums, advertisements, and popular culture. Its serene, idealized features, inlaid with lapis lazuli and wearing the Nemes headdress and false beard of kingship, embodied the mystery and majesty of a lost civilization. That this face represented a minor king who ruled briefly during a troubled period seemed irrelevant. The image transcended historical details to become a symbol. What lessons does Tutankhamun's story offer to contemporary leadership and governance? His reign presents a fascinating case study in leadership. Under extreme constraints, a young, physically disabled ruler trying to govern through regents with their own agendas, inheriting a kingdom in religious